The Human Torch was denied a bank loan. Hey, I'm Poe Phoenix, the digital mercenary. I'm an illustrator, and I've been specializing in vector portraits for the last 3-4 years. But I have a question to ask you. Do you like vectors? Because I got all the vector information for you today. We're going to be talking about my process when I come to do portraits, which includes everything from lighting techniques, how I structure my layers, file organization. We're going to talk about masking, which is really important to my process, as well as try to create a depth of field effect inside of Affinity Designer. Well, try is the main word here. But hey, we're gonna jump in and figure out how to do it, and let's get going. Okay, now this is so basically what I do in the beginning. I always try to just set the stage of what I'm working on. So I try to create the I do a quick draw over of the illustration to get a lot of the structure down. And what happens is sometimes I do overlays where the lines overlap. But instead of going through the whole process of cutting them out as like I used to, I use a technique where I would create a shape, a vector, the size of the space that I want to remove, and then I turn to invisible, and then I group the that layer, the two layers into one, and the erase layer will basically delete the spaces I want. It becomes a non-destructive element, and I can adjust it to my liking. I found that a lot easier than going through the whole process of like individually cutting out the vectors, and it still keeps everything in one shape. So you can mask it out if you want to. It's super flexible and it's super useful, and you'll see that I use it a lot while I'm creating these portraits. When I'm creating the eyes, I usually create a circle. Like as you see, I do two circles, outline and a solid, and then I group those and put those inside of a mask that is shaped like the eye itself. This allows me to maintain the circle and the eye, and it's easier to mess with later on. These eyebrows, the way I do them is my own take on the technique I saw an artist named Jen Bartel do in one of her digital paintings. And it was really focused on these thin strokes to help create the elements of the eye, and I've adapted it into a vector form. Now, this is super important that a lot of people kind of skip over is labeling your layers. Like it's so important to do this, and a lot of people just think it's stupid or it takes too long to do, but it's really important because you never know who's going to have your files later on, especially if you're working with a client and you deliver the files to them and they can't figure out how to access the different aspects of an illustration that you may have created for them. On another note, if you want to like focus just on you and not the client, what happens is like say you work on this today and then like a year and a half from now, you got to go back in and make a new version of this thing. Now you're stuck with a folder that you can't even navigate because you don't know where all the pieces is. Now you have 100 layers that you got to go through and turn on and off and try to figure out the best way to do it. And now you're going crazy and you're stressed out. But if you labeled everything and organized everything in a nice manner, like I try to break down each piece of the illustration into its own grouping. So everything inside of it doesn't have to be labeled, but every grouping is labeled. So you'll see like eye, left eye, right eye, nose, mouth, head. Just so I can see it. Just in case I can't visually recognize what the thumbnail in the layer panel is saying. It's a really good technique to help keep your files organized because you just never know how you're going to use them in the future. And it's better to be prepared than not prepared. You know, right now I'm working on this beard, and beards are really tough because there's a lot of hairs. I don't know if you ever seen a beard or had a beard, but there's just hair and lines everywhere. And what I realized is that it's a fine line between too many lines and not enough lines. So you always got to kind of juggle back and forth. And it took me a long time to kind of figure that aspect out. Now that I've got the outline of the character down, I got the likeness. I can start focusing on color blocking, of the character and figuring out how this character is going to look for this illustration. And right now, this is a very simple illustration where I'm just kind of recreating what is in the portrait. So I'm trying to mimic the colors, but not get it exactly. Like the whole focus of my illustration style is not really realism. You know, my colors aren't one to one to the photo. The skin tones aren't exactly the same. None of that stuff honestly really matters to me. Like my goal is always to try to create something that's believable. You know, even with when I get to the point where I'm using lighting and the likeness of the person, it's not to create a one to one or a super photorealistic take on this person. It's my goal is to create a believable recreation of the subject matter that I am creating art of. You know, so when I work in that manner, it allows me to um, be more flexible in what I'm doing, and I'm not completely beholden to the photograph. Because if you want something that's photo real, you might as well just take a photo, because that's just not my thing, you know. And this year, like I've been starting to work more with gradients, as you can see now, and I feel like it helps add more to the believability that I'm talking about. As you see the colors start to transition from place to place, it's I'm working trying to find a balance between them and find the right contrast between the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights. And it's sometimes it can be difficult, especially with vector, because it's not something that blends. You know, there's not a lot of blending in in vector work unless you're doing something, unless you're using a lot of gradients and transparencies, which I use, but I use those sparingly. You know, it's because again, I don't want it to be photoreal. I want it to look fun. I want it to look cool. I want it to be interesting and make you wonder, why did he do this, or is that realistic, or does that work? Like that's I'm more focused on trying to make sure everything works within the narrative of the illustration that I'm drawing, you know. And as you'll see in a little while, I'll start to group these shadows together so that I can easily find them and jump back and forth with them later on throughout the piece. Because even though I'm doing it now, this is not the last time I'm going to do shadows. Like I try to work all the way from the darkest part to the lightest part, as if as if a painter does. You know, I try to study a lot of different painting techniques to get a better understanding of how they deal with color. You know, while vectors are more flexible in terms of their destructibility and like nothing is permanent, there is always spaces to find new ways to create things and to generate the same type of effects that a digital painter would do, you know. And see, now I'm working on, this is where I get into more of like the highlights and the second, how, now here's a trick that you need to, that I took a while for me to learn, is that when it comes to shadows, like it's not just one solid block of color. And there's always pieces of the face that push out past where the shadow is and into the light. And that usually, that usually is revealed in a color that's the same as the base color of the person. Right. And in this case, it's like this light brown, or yeah, it's light brown color. And so I'm mimicking it, and I'm pulling it from the gradient that I use in the background. So it's going to change depending on where it's at in the photo, which also gives it more a diverse look to it. And you want it to break up. You want the colors to be varied throughout, to give the person who looks at it different things to look at and to examine when they see the photo. Because if you have it just be flat with one color, then it starts to get boring quickly. And I'm being real loose with a lot of the lines, because especially around the eyes, because I know further on down the line I'm going to cover all this space up with the eyes, with the pupils. So I'm not really worried about if it matches the line work because it's going to be covered up. So always pull like colors back into the shadows because it helps bring, because light bounces. That's a lot of, that's the biggest part of understanding how that light works. It bounces. It's not just one set thing. So even if it is coming from the top, it may hit part of the cheek and bounce back up into the eyelids. Or like there is something in the room that's bouncing light back onto the subject from a different direction from the actual main light source. And that's things that you have to consider when you start to do lighting. And that's what I mean about storytelling. It's like what's happening in the room, what's happening in the place where this photo was taking place. Like that needs to be taken in consideration when you start to color and lay down how the light works. And there's a lot of little subtle things that appear in illustrations. I mean, in photos and portraits that you always have to take consideration. Like there is like this little, like I'm right now dragging out this light, and it's a light that's going to eventually be covered up. But it's the fact that it's there and it's transparent. It'll help bring more of that believability that I'm searching for in this piece, you know. And it's always a work in progress to try to figure out how things work. And I jump around to see what may or may not work because you got to experiment. There's no one set way to do things. Like right now, I'm jumping through different layer styles to see if I do an overlay over his face, I can get a good representation of lighting. And now this is like a little softer cast that's sitting on top. And now I can go back in and add more lighting to his face, which will bring increased depth to the photo while also not being completely held to the standard of what the reference is. The reference is a reference. It's not the blueprint. It's a reference. So you can take what you want and leave what you don't. And I tend to do that a lot. I just use I'll allow the reference to help me get ideas for where I can place lighting. Like right now, like there's a second layer of highlights on him that kind of create more of the roundness to his eyes. And I try to also, I'm not beholden to it because like you'll see like some lights that I add aren't exactly in that photo, but I think they make sense in context to this illustration that I'm building right now. And that's the difference between photoreal and my type of vector work. I'm more concerned about the world that I'm building within this portrait and not so much about recreating what another artist created in the photo that they took. And this photo was taken by the person who is in this portrait. His name is Rashid Zakat. He's a good friend of mine. He was good enough to allow me to use his portrait for this picture. And but I want to also, I don't want to, I'm not doing I didn't want to completely do the exact same thing he did, but I wanted to take my spin on it, and that's where art is. It's always like my art is a constant remix of things, because that's basically what pop art is. It's constantly remixing what other people did and borrowing from this part, borrowing from that part, combining it to two things to make something new, and I'm combining the reference of his photo with the style I see as vector art. And I think I do a damn pretty job. I do a pretty good job. I enjoy it. I hope you enjoy it. If not, you'll tell me. The internet is not shy of anything. And like here, I'm figuring out some ideas or ways to try to use some gradients to add some different layers to this piece. Going back in, adjusting things. And sometimes I may get really far with a lighting style and then decide that it's not working and trash it and come back in with new shapes to see if I can get something that is a lot better for me. And the thing that always happens to me while I'm doing these illustrations, like at this point, my whole feeling is that it's not working exactly the way I want to, because like it never feels real to me until I start working on the eyes, because the eyes will tie in everything to the piece. Well, even though right now I'm doing ears, it's that's the way I see it. Like ears, like this stuff like this, like you can easily forget about ears, but it's like the little details that you add to an illustration where like a light may hit that's just off center, that'll bring more of that trust into the piece, that makes people become more engaged with the artwork. So I try to bring in as much detail as I can see, and I also try to do these things over um, in sections. Like, I'll do like half the illustration and then take a break and come back so I can get fresh eyes on it. Fresh eyes. See, I brought it back. No, no, just me. All right. Uh, Now, like, I'm adding more detail. Like, I finally got around to the hat, and I have this very loose style to the way I color. Like, I I I think I color like a fifth grader. I don't stay in the lines. They don't. They are also like a reference. So if you look at any of my past work and even this work too, you'll see that like I'm not following every curve of that hat. And there's color bursting out the sides of his face because it's it's not important to be restrained by the the line work. That's art is a free form type of thing, and you got to be able to just be willing to do what feels right. That's the weirdest thing about art as a whole, is while it has all these rules and it's all these technicalities to it and things that you should and shouldn't do, and like a body is 8 heads high, and like there's a certain amount of space between each eye, and like all these things, it's like none of that stuff matters in the long run. What it comes down to is, what does your art say about you? Are you telling the story you want to tell? Like, that's what matters the most when it comes to this stuff. And that's what I try to do. And like finally right now I got to the point where I'm working on the eyes, and now it starts to feel real as a portrait to me. Like I'm starting to get more into who the person is, and that's who this is, like, to me, where a lot of my portraits come alive. It's like what I do with the eyes, because that can tell a lot about the person. If he just had black eyes, that would have a different feel to me, giving him like pupils and an iris and having like tones within the eyes, and like all that stuff matters because it helps sell the identity of this person to you when you look at it. And you can help build the story. Like, see, it helps you get another layer of the idea of the story I'm trying to tell you through this artwork. You know, Picking colors, pulling stuff from the illustration. Oh, there's a tip that I do. So I'll be real, like, there's still stuff about Affinity Designer I don't know. And that's awesome to me, because it allows me to still learn things as I go along. And I still haven't figured out how to eyedrop a gradient. So what I tend to do is, if I want multiple things that have the same gradient, I select all of them and then do the gradient in that, and then go back and adjust it for each shape. And that's what I'm doing now. Like, I did both eyes at once, and then I went back to adjust the direction so the lighting is correct for each eye. It's an extra step, but it's, for me, it's important that the eyes have some type of similarity to them, and it's not random, unless I'm creating a character who has random eyes, and then forget about that whole thing I just said. Yeah. How much time is left? Oh my God. So, um, details are super important, because it allows things for the viewer to look at and to scrutinize, and things they can see later on. Now, this is another tip with the erase technique. You're going to see it in a second while I try to draw this highlight for this beard. And I'm still not 100% happy with this beard, but work got to get done. So I made a bunch of adjustments, but I was trying to add like more strands to his beard, which I've done a few times for beards. It gives it a certain look, but it just was not working. And I was trying to use my erase technique to help, because what I was noticing is that the hair wasn't lining up inside of um, the beard. And so I created the erase technique. And what the erase technique will do is cut through the layers so that it will go down to the back layer of the beard, but it has to be in the right folder or it will cut all the way through to the back of the piece as I create the lines. But it just still didn't look right. It just looked sloppy and not well kept, and that's not the effect I wanted. So eventually I just ended up just deleting all those lines after I did all that work, and it was frustrating. But we move on, we push forward, and I think the final decision was pretty good, you know, tweaking the lines and the color weights. Again, I don't want it to be perfect. I want it to be believable, and that's the key part to this. Now, this is how I prepare my files for adding textures to them, right? Now, no, there's a bunch of different ways to add textures to your illustrations, but in this instance, I'm using a texture overlay to create the texture that I want, right? And you'll see me pull it in, but in order to do that, I need to create a outline of the entire illustration so that I can create is basically merging all the shapes into one shape that can then be used as a mask for the texture that I'm going to bring in. So that's why I'm deleting all the lines. I mean, all the layers. Like I put this yellow line on it just so I can see it, and then I started to look through my archive for um, textures. Uh, but I wanted to see how it would look to test it out. The mask works great. It covers the whole illustration. And so I'm trying different layer styles to get it to see which works best. And I think I landed on color dodge, but I had to test out a bunch of different ones to see which effect would give me the best look I wanted. Because I wanted it to overlay but not be dominant. And usually what I do is after I select the layer style, I lower the opacity a little bit, and that will um, help it blend into the vectors easier instead of just having like instead of it being hard and in your face. I wanted to feel more integrated into the illustration, you know. So all right, now we're gonna work on depth of field thing, which is basically when a camera lens focuses on one part of the photo and everything else starts to uh, go out of focus. While you can use the mask layers, I like having more control over my mask. And the way I do that is the same way I did um, I was using the erase technique in the beginning. So right now I'm shaping the mask while I can see it, and then I'm going to flip it. I'm going to blur everything behind it, and then what I'll do is I'll select the curve mask out the face, and then adjust the blur. And it gets pretty good, you know. And when I look back at this version, I think this is a good way to go to get it done. It's like simple, it's straight to the point. But the thing was, I kept getting a hard edge on the I kept getting a hard edge on the shape itself. And I can't blur the shape because if I do, then the photo inside the curve, the ellipse, will also blur. So I had to come up with a different way. So what I did was I flipped it. I cut the blur out of the. I put the blur. Yeah, I cut the hole out of the blurred illustration. Then blurred the mask, which gives me the soft edge I wanted, and also with the clean, sharp illustration in the layer below it, it provided the effect that I needed. And I'm still able to go in and easily adjust the shape of the mask and to get it exactly how I want it to create the effect that I need. And because it's so blurred, I have to push and pull the curve so that it doesn't completely eradicate all the line work, but it makes it just enough that you can see, you know? And I think I came out pretty good. I mean, it needs some work. If I did it again, I would create different layers of of the blur. Like I would have like a really sharp, I mean, a really harsh. I'd have less blur at the front, near his face, and then I have another layer that is more blurred, and then that secondary blur would blur out the rest of the body. You know, I know I said blur like 40 times just now, but we're blurring the lines between fact and fiction? No? Okay. I'll see myself out. Don't worry. This is almost over for both of us. So, I mean, for the most part, it worked out, but there's definitely room for improvement. And for the first time, like I figured this out while we were doing this, you know, and this is experimentation right in front of you. This is like jazz, baby. It's like it's the art that you see in between the nodes. Nobody, you know, I guess that reference. Okay, yeah, but this is still good. But I'm going to keep working on this technique. It's something that you can mess with and create some ill effects if you like kind of take some time out to work on it. Like some of the errors I was seeing is getting that some of the edges were starting to push out onto the sides, and it was making it too sharp, so the blur wasn't really working right. So I had to push and pull the shape, which I realized after I did this video. But that's something to look out for. Like the edges can still be sharp if you don't go in and pull them into the away from the edges of the blur, if that makes sense. If it doesn't, shoot me a DM on Twitter or IG, and I can try to explain it, I guess. But this is the final. I think it came out pretty good, and let me know what you think.
Woo! All right. Hope you enjoyed that session. Got a little crazy there for a second, but I think we got the gist of it. The depth of field could use a little work, and if you notice, I did some tweaks afterwards to kind of change up the beard. I think it needed to be black, and I didn't realize it until after I recorded all the video. But I think it all came out good. And like always, if you want to follow my work, you can follow me at Pope Phoenix on Instagram and Twitter. And I'm always around if you need help. I have advice and techniques and bad jokes, a lot of a lot of randomness. But I'm always here to help young designers or anyone that's looking to try to create digital art. And I'm here to help, you know. All I ask is that you be kind to yourself. Pope Phoenix out.